Anyway, so Mark Hopfenbeck will be chairing the afternoon with me, and as I said, with Val, Mark is also one of the key people involved in coordinating the project. Mark has been teaching open dialogue in Norway for about 10 years now, and really kind of is fairly fearless in his teaching of it. So when it comes to setting clinicians right in role plays, as you may have heard from Heather, it's Mark who's fearless enough to step in and correct people and really show people how to do things. And we'll be hearing from Mark later on in the afternoon about the whole course itself, which he leads on the design of. Before Mark, we've got Professor Steve Pilling, who's here with us today. Some of you may know Steve Pilling is a very senior academic psychologist in the UK, advises NICE. I went to Steve a couple of years ago, nearly a couple of years ago now, with the idea that we're going to do this study, we've got all of these trusts together, we've got all of these teams who are going on training, and one day we'll come back to you with hopefully a robust evidence base so you can think about influencing NICE and the Department of Health and all these people who Steve is linked up with. And I've actually said this to a few audiences, but never in front of Steve, but it's a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever watched Dragon's Den. It's a bit like that, because usually in Dragon's Den, sometimes in Dragon's Den, the entrepreneur, halfway through the pitch, the dragons start pitching to the entrepreneur, saying, we think this is really good, I want to be involved. And that's basically how it happened. And Steve started to talk about how he was very passionate about this way of working, and actually how when he did the original research around home treatment teams, this was very much more of a social model is what he was hoping to promote, but it didn't happen so much when it hit the ground. And so I kind of asked him, would you like to be involved? And he said yes, and so there he is. Now he's involved, and Steve has now been the chief investigator for the academic bit of the project, and he's brought together an absolutely five-star panel of academics from several universities in London to basically lead a major grant application to the National Institute of Health Research for £2.3 million in order for us to be able to evaluate this fully. And it will be the biggest piece of research ever done into open dialogue if we do get the money to do it. I was just hearing from Steve now about some feedback we got from our latest application round, which doesn't sound too bad. Sounds like we're doing okay, but you can never know with these things because we're competing with every other kind of healthcare research application out there. Anyway, lots to learn about the research project and how it can work. And so we're very lucky today to have with us as our next speaker, Professor Steve Pilling.
So thank you very much, Russell. My apologies that perhaps one or two of you in the audience may already have heard a version of this talk, but I think the questions that I'm going to be raising over the next 20 or so minutes are still valid and very much relate to the overall proposal to evaluate open dialogue. Now, as Russell said, I've been leading this program. We have indeed a very impressive group of collaborators, co-applicants on this research project. Our key task, of course, in any project like this is to get yourself an acronym. So I've probably spent more time on the acronym than on anything else. But I think it's not a bad one. I tried to work a why in there, but failed. So this is about the Odyssey research program. So this is about a journey which may become of mythical proportions or may just turn out to be rather ordinary. But anyway, that's the title. It stands for Open Dialogue Evaluation of a Social Network Interaction in Severe Mental Illness. You can work out where the S's and the I's came from on that one if you get a little bored during this talk. So the first question I think worth asking is open dialogue what I've called a plausible evaluation, a plausible intervention fit for evaluation? Can we convince the National Institute for Health Research that this is something worth investing £2 or more million in over 5 or 6 years, when, as Russell says, we've got a lot of competition? And I think we can. One of the reasons I think we can, even if one stands back immediately from open dialogue itself and the particular approach, the particular way of working associated with it. It's worth saying, I think in that early conversation with Russell, I mentioned that I'd been around in this business for quite a while. And I remember going back to the early 1950s with work at Graylingwell, later Maxwell Jones at Dingwell, and then work around London, naturally and elsewhere, where people have tried to focus on the social network and see it as an area for intervention. And that's the reason for that, I think, is pretty clear, that social networks, their quality, their nature, are implicated both in the development and the maintenance of mental disorders. And that's been known for a long time. There's a couple of recent reviews just referenced on the slide there. But what really hasn't happened is that actually there's been a consistent effort, despite its importance, to turn that into what I'd call an intervention, a legitimate intervention, that actually might bring about some change in those networks. And with Gemma Hardy sitting at the front here and Lisa Wood, we've been doing a systematic review focused particularly on those interventions, those studies which have actually tried to use a social network as a social network intervention to bring about change in that network, to bring about sustained change in people's lives. And actually, despite it being around as an idea for 50 or more years, there's a real paucity of data in this area. Russell mentioned I got interested some time ago this when with Sonia Johnson and others I was involved in the evaluations of the crisis and home treatment teams just up the road in Islington. And John Holt, who was a central character in that whole programme, having done work previously in Sydney, John was very keen on focusing on the social network. And when in fact we went to look at the literature, very broad-based review using some fairly liberal inclusion criteria, actually John Holt's studies in Sydney were the ones that actually came up where someone was actually trying to thoughtfully intervene at the level of the social network. But only 4 of the studies that we found across 16 publications were actually RCTs. And this is a point that Russell and I discussed earlier on. If we're actually going to get open dialogue on the agenda for the NHS, if you want to call it that, then we do need high quality evidence. And the measure for that really is RCT quality evidence. Have we got RCTs that demonstrate its value? You've got work from Yako and others which show potential benefits. Has that really been developed, delivered in the context of an effective comparator? There's some work that needs adapted work and similar that has focused on people who have more severe mental illness. But as I say, few intervene directly with the network. And then the other interesting research question from my perspective about open dialogue is not only can we do some research, some formal research of the proper counterfactual, which demonstrates that social network interventions, or open dialogue in this case, actually are effective, but can we learn something about what makes it effective? And so one thing we'd want to do with this study is look to see if whether changes in social network actually appear to be the mediator of change. Is it the change that occurs in a person's social network that's improved with reduced symptoms, better quality of life, better engagement with their world around them, and a chance to go on and live a fuller life? There's then another question, which is a challenging one, I think, and Russell referred to the reviews that we've had back from NIHR, and a couple of them raise, I think, perfectly valid question about whether or not we can implement open dialogue in the UK, in fact, in the English system. And there's some pilot work in NELF that you'll probably hear about later today. There's a work that Mark and Russell have been doing on the training programme that actually suggests that you can, but it's a suggestion. It's by no means solid evidence. And then finally, can we actually evaluate it? And if we're going to evaluate it formally in a randomised controlled trial, we need to specify it. We need an adequate design that's robust and scientifically defensible. we need clarity about what our outcomes are, and we need to be able to characterise the comparator just as well as the intervention itself. And when we've done all that, do we think that we will be able to say enough about the service style changes, about the restructuring and reorganisation of the current functional model of mental health services that we have here in England? Can we say enough to give this some bite? And that's a real challenge, as you'll know the history. I'll give another example of interventions I've been involved in, reviewing family interventions or CBT for psychosis. Pretty solid evidence base of different kinds for both, but actually really pretty poor uptake in many services. So we could find that open dialogue looks like a real winner, but we may struggle to effectively intervene. So here's the outline of the proposed programme. This is the acronym spelled out for you: Open Dialogue Development and Evaluation of a Social Network Intervention for Severe Mental Illness. It's a 5-year programme. This belies the age of the, this is where we are actually. We're waiting the outcome of the Stage 2 review. We have, I think, 7 of 9 reviews in. We have to respond to those by the beginning of May, and sometime in July we'll find out whether or not we got funded. Depends who you talk to, but I think our chances are about 40–50% of getting that money. So it's by no means a guarantee. If we don't succeed, I think we'll try again just as a straightforward trial, explain something of the programme grant method here. So you know, we won't give up straight away, but it's not easy. What the current programme of research contains is 5 separate but linked work packages, and I'll describe those in a minute. But at its centre lies a large multi-centre cluster randomised trial. And again, I'll say something about that. We have 5 trusts interested, involved and committed, and some very helpfully wrote a supporting letter which backs up our research programme. And we are a considerable way along the road to having trained up a sufficient cohort of staff that we believe that we can start the programme of research off on a good footing. And all that really helps the work Russell, Mark and others have done, many of you in this room, puts us in a much stronger position in terms of potentially securing funding than would otherwise be the case. If we are successful in June, the earliest we could start, because these things are painfully slow, is February of next year. And that means we'll probably be finishing sometime in early 2022. So quite a time away, but actually that's the kind of scale of things if we're going to be able to deliver. What do we want to try and do in this programme? Well, we want to see that we have a programme that can be, a protocol that can be developed that's acceptable both to clinicians and service users for the management of mental health crises in the NHS. And if we can't do that at the beginning, our chances of rolling this out beyond the completion of a successful trial are going to be limited. It's really crucial now in any healthcare intervention that we're not only assessing its clinical effectiveness, but we also want to look at cost effectiveness. Does it not just produce a better outcome, but is that better outcome value for money? And our primary interest here is reduced time to relapse, and linked to that, improved quality of the social network. Can we accurately describe, understand, and therefore inform future implementation programs of the organisational changes needed to effectively deliver open dialogue? And what's been service users and families, and indeed the wider network's experience of open dialogue, and how much can that itself inform a further development and revision of the open dialogue model? So that, what I've just talked you through there is expressed perhaps for some of us a little more clearly in a single diagram there, which shows that in the first, probably be now more like 15 months, taking into account work programs 1 and 2, the initial development of the program. We'll have running through the core of it a large multi-centre trial with an economic evaluation. And throughout the whole of the programme, we're going to be looking at the implementation and organisational challenges associated with open dialogue. Because I think from my first conversation with Russell, I very much had it in my mind that open dialogue is both an intervention and a service style change. It's a significant shift in the way we provide mental health services, certainly in England. And we want to understand, and that's the final work programme, something of service user experience. So, a bit of detail. We've started some of this already, but we want to be looking at refining, developing, establishing the intervention so that we're fit for purpose across all participating sites. We've been working on a draft operational protocol, which actually tries to capture the key elements of open dialogue, but recognises that if it's going to be effective, there will be some different ways in which those key elements, those key functions of open dialogue are provided in services, partly reflecting the period of change that the introduction of open dialogue will mean for many services, but also just recognising that it's going to be a little bit different from what might be happening in Nottingham to what might be happening in Havering. Things are going to be different, and a system that can preserve its key functions but adapt to local circumstances, one that's more likely to succeed. As part of that, we're also beginning to looking at development of a peer support programme, which is a kind of bit of an add-on, if you like, but in my view, an extremely important add-on, in which peer support workers become integral members of the open dialogue team and have a particular, if not sole, focus on developing and maintaining social networks. We're not going to get £2.5 million out of the National Institute for Health Research on the promise that we can deliver a trial with several hundred people in it. We're going to have to do a pilot trial initially, which is going to be a crucial element, a crucial first stage of this research. It's called, in the jargon, it has some stop-go criteria, but basically you have in front of you there 6 criteria. Can we recruit 10% of the sample? Can we retain participants? Can we collect outcome data? How are we doing on consenting people to the trial? Are the teams up and running, and are they adherent to the model? And we have criteria against each of those, and if we do not meet those criteria, the minimum that will happen is we'll have a very difficult discussion with NIHR about whether it's possible to continue the trial, and if we seriously undershoot them, we'll be handing back a good £1.8 million to NIHR. It will be painful, but to be perfectly honest, it's the better thing to do than to continue a trial where we are intending to engage people in a study, knowing that we're never going to be able to recruit the numbers to provide a clear outcome. And that just is, as well as being a misuse of public money, it's an unethical thing to do, and we won't do that. The multi-centre trial itself is excuse the jargon here, but it's a pragmatic 2-arm cluster trial. Really what that means is that we have relatively limited criteria. We're not trying to be too selective. And by cluster we mean that we're not randomising here individual participants, service users, or indeed randomising at the level of the family. We're randomising the teams themselves. So we're saying North Devon and South Devon will be in the trial, not that they are, and we'll randomly allocate them either to the intervention arm or to the control arm. And as you're thinking about that already, think, gosh, that's quite a complex intervention. Well, you're right. And it gets even more complex when you've got to do that with 22 clusters over a period of time. And what you want to do is recruit to that 500 people over a sort of 12 to 15 month period who are in crisis and meet the criteria that you can see in front of you. And what we want to demonstrate is that the intervention, the open dialogue, over and above standard care, which will be usual standard crisis teams, that what it does is it reduces the time to relapse. That has obvious and important benefits. And we'll collect a lot of other data as well to try and accurately describe what happens. So this trial is absolutely at the core of it. But as important, if you like, as that central randomised trial is a process of understanding the organisational change, its implications for implementation, And we'll do that in a number of ways. We've planned throughout the period of the trial to have a series of stakeholder consultations with staff, with NHS managers, with commissioners, with service users. We're already working with Doug Zadonis and others on developing adherence and fidelity measures so that if open dialogue in our trial doesn't work, and that is possible, it will not, at least we will know it hasn't worked because we've done it to the best possible standards in the most effective manner and it's still not delivered. It would be criminal, really, for us to discover halfway through that we're not doing it properly and that's why it's not worked. So being very clear about how much you're delivering, how much open dialogue is what it says it is on the tin, the contents are there, is a really important aspect of this trial. We want to know about what staff experience is. We want to refine and develop the training that Mark and others have been doing so that we get a training program that's fit for purpose. If this works, there are going to be potentially some very ambitious rollout plans come on the back of this study. And you will not get much rollout, you will not get much uptake if you haven't got staff who are trained to do it. So we have to start to think now, and throughout this research, what's going to be the most effective training model. And we want to pilot, well actually when we've looked at this, we've decided pilot was a bit ambitious, so the final bullet point should probably say model. We want to just model what it would mean for the restructuring of a mental health service if we had the proper uptake of open dialogue within a particular area. So say we remodeled services in Waltham Forest or South Nottingham. What would that actually mean? What would that reconfiguration involve? And crucial to all this is not only, from my discussions with people, talking to Russell and others, is not only can we produce better outcomes, but is the experience itself of open dialogue a different one than have hitherto happened. And one thing we're particularly interested in here is about the process of decision making. So do service users, do their families feel much more active participants in decisions that are made about their care than in standard services? And again, is that an important variable that tells us something about why it's effective or not? It's perfectly possible that actually you might find variation between sites on a number of these measures. We'll try our damnedest to ensure that we have high fidelity across the patch, but I've been involved in a number of such trials in the past, and I can tell you, despite your best efforts, you don't always do that. Now, you can just see that as a failure, and if it falls too far, it possibly is. But it's also an opportunity to try and learn something about the experience of that. And we'll go a bit deeper and actually try and look at the experience of individual people and their families and draw on that to flesh out, to help us better understand what we learn from the rather more dry quantitative data that we'll be collecting. So that's the plan. It's ambitious. It's I haven't got the list of names up, I should have, but it's got, as Russell said, a fantastic team of people from largely, sad to say for those of you not from London, it's a bit London-centric, but I think as a northerner I'm sort of allowed to do this without feeling too guilty. It's a bit London-centric, but we've got a good mix of service user researchers, Sarah Carr, people involved, Corinne, others in developing that aspect of it, people with long track records, Sonia Johnson, Tom Craig in developing a program, evaluating these programs, and Tim Weaver and others about the organisational changes. So it's a strong team. That won't be why we fail, if indeed we do fail, but it's a potentially very exciting opportunity to produce what, as Russell said, would be the largest ever trial done in this area, with potentially really quite important outcomes for the NHS and a chance to move away from what I think has become a really rather rigid and unfortunately not very effective functional model. It's a great opportunity if we can deliver to change things for the better. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think we need to get the microphone. Okay. Okay, so I don't know who's carrying the mics, who's doing the mics. So we'll get a couple of questions to Steve. And I'm looking around to see who... Sorry, we've got Lauren here. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so questions for Steve.
Hi. Thanks for that very interesting talk. Two questions, one of which is very quick. I was just wondering why a trial hasn't been done on open dialogue before like this, given it, I think it's been running for 20 years in Finland. Also, what do you think the role of research would be to let us know, to give us more information about whether open dialogue would work across different cultural contexts? I'm thinking of all the different cultural groups that I work with in London, in North London.
The first question, I think that's just a good question. Why has it not been done before? I guess you might say that the catchment area of West Lapland's a bit small for organising a trial, but I think we've got a selection of different sites. We've got the sort of what I call the inner city, but with none of its advantages, Borough, Waltham Forest. And then we've got inner city in Nottingham. People here can describe that. So I think there's some variation. But look, is this a definitive trial? I'm not sure. I think one thing that we would want to do, if we are successful, if we do find a positive, is follow up this group of people. And then I think, do you want to repeat this trial again, or do you want to get a bit smarter about your methods of implementation and how you build proper evaluation into implementation? We're very poor. I mean, if you look, for example, at the IAP program with 95% plus T1, T2 data, I can't think of another single area in mental health to get anywhere near that. If we had some of that, then maybe we'd need a few less trials. But it's a good question. Yeah.
You asked the question about cross-culture?
The cross-cultural thing, I think I did answer it in a sense by saying, I think within the degree of diversity that you see across the sites from Avon and Wiltshire through to Nottingham, through to Kent, I think within the variation of that, then we've got a range of diverse communities that we can look at, and the process work that we will be doing should inform that. Are there variations in which people from different cultures can engage and take that up? It's a good question. I think we should have good enough data to at least point to some further interesting questions to ask.
Okay, my question was about how you were going to evaluate outcomes or define what outcomes are. For example, recovery is a very beleaguered term.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of material that is coming out now is kind of just pulling the government's agenda of push people back to work is considered to be recovery, etc. So there's lots of controversies around what outcomes are for different groups of people. And so my question is about how are you going to decide on what it is?
Well, we've decided, and we'll use relapse, and we'll use time to relapse. And the measure we'll use in that is a measure developed by Paul Bebbington and Tom Craig and others for the Leo trial, which we'll use a case note-based system to assess on a review by independent people of monthly recordings. I've used it in a trial, and I think I think we debated this long and hard. I think symptoms are probably not a very good measure. Hospitalisation is not a very good measure. The thresholds vary from site to site. So in the end, we went for relapse, and we went for time to relapse just to give us a bit more power with the calculation. We've just done simply relapse or not, we'd probably have 1,000 people in the study. So I'm reasonably confident, because it's been used and validated elsewhere, that we have a fairly robust measure, and we know that repeated relapses are associated with poorer outcomes. It's okay. We have other secondary measures in there, but I think we've nailed our flag pretty firmly to that mast.
Hi.
Yep, go ahead.
So I'm interested. I've got two questions
Yeah,
really.
fine.
Yeah. Hi.
It's
One
a
is
weird echo here, I'll tell you. Very strange.
So, really good to see that the research is happening. Really pleased that I, myself, am recovery lead in Nottingham, so, will be kind of part of this. But, and particularly pleased to see that you conceptualise it as an organisational change, not just structurally, but perhaps in the way that conversations are held within an organisation that's really seeing itself as being, a context for open dialogue. But I was particularly interested then in that you were seeing the mechanism lying in changes in the social network, and yet your outcome measures and your questions that you were asking of the qualitative aspect of the research didn't seem to reflect on that. So you're interested in people's experience of decision making, but how are you going to actually discover what the mechanism is? I have to say I'm quite uncomfortable with seeing the mechanism as being solely within the social changes in the social network.
We lighted upon this because of the emphasis of the social network as a means by which you both delivered the intervention, and also the fact that, going back to that first slide I put up, social networks seem to me very clearly implicated in both, or problems in the social network, very clearly implicated in both the development of mental health problems and their maintenance. Now, that's not to say that the only cause of a person's difficulties is a problem in their social network. Of course, that simply can't be true. But if you want to look at, if you're trying to bring about a change by working with the social network, you might reasonably expect that changes in that network would be associated with better outcomes. So it's not saying that the only possible means by which it changes, it's saying it's an important one. And the other issue, which is we're not going to be using this in the primary analysis as we're looking at a mediator of effect. We'll look at a number of moderators of effect as well in the study when we in the analysis when we come to it. But it also struck me that actually how much might some of those changes in the network also be reflected in shared decision making, how involved people are in decision making. And part of the reason for doing these things isn't just to it makes for good statistics, but it's also should, if we do it well, inform people about the intervention itself. It seems to me it would be really sad. I'll give you an example. CBT for depression. Now, CBT for depression fared pretty well in the original NIMH studies. For the last 40 years, people like Steve Hull and Rob DeRubis have been involved in a battle in the US between saying, is CBT as good or better than antidepressants for treatment of depression? And the answer is not really any different now than it was 40 years ago. What it's meant is that CBT for depression hasn't really moved on in 40 years, and our outcomes aren't that great compared to, say, changes for CBT in anxiety disorder. So I'd hope that some of what we do here would prompt Russell and Jaco and others to think, actually, does this research tell us something about what we're doing? Might it point different ways in which you can improve and develop open dialogue, particularly open dialogue as we might be applying it in the UK? So it may be a bit ambitious, it may be a bit presumptuous of me, but I think it'd be nice if the research told us a bit more than whether it just worked.
I just worry that by being so it's the first thing you say is that families are implicated in the inception and in the maintenance of health problems. That's sort of that's the primary sentence you're saying. It just feels as though it's so easy to...
I tell you what I'd say. I'd say in my defence, I didn't say that. Actually, I didn't say that. But anyway.
One or two more questions, I think.
So, okay. I'm not great at expressing myself, so I'll try and make sense of this. Leading on from the last question, because that interested me as well, was the mention and the change in the social network. And it led me to think about work on self-stigma. And I wondered what you guys thought about, in the traditional medical model, great insight in a patient is seen as a positive thing in terms of outcomes. However, we have discovered in the literature now that if that insight is countered by self-stigma, that the outcomes drop off for people. So if you're not self-stigmatizing and you have good insight, you have good outcomes. If you've got good insight and high levels of self-stigma, you've got bad outcomes. the literature suggests that 30% of people with a diagnosis of mental health condition suffer from self-stigma. Do you think one of the mechanics at play here could be that the change in the social fabric allows someone to stop self-stigmatizing? And in a sense, are you treating self-stigma as one of the mechanics? And also the contextual disclosure, you may be disclosing to people you hadn't disclosed to before, and also literature around Pat Corrigan's work in the States showing that disclosure is a great counter to self-stigma. So I just wondered what you thought about that. The other thing I thought about in the process decision making, I too triggered questions with me, and I wondered if a measure of empowerment might be a useful tool to gauge.
I think we have a recovery, we have a measure in there. I'll look back, I can't immediately recall. Do you know, Gemma? About empowerment. Answer is I don't know, but I've got another answer. But I'll just quickly cover my embarrassment of not being able to remember everything clearly. But I think that's a really interesting question. And actually, I don't think we've got the resource to be able to do it. But what we have got is a large number of people, and I mean both the staff involved in this and the service users and their family, who I think potentially would be very interested in pursuing that kind of question. So I would hope that out of, if we get this money, and that's a big if, but if we got it, there are fantastic opportunities for people to do nested studies within it to maybe address exactly that question. So if there are any budding PhD students out there who would fancy doing something along those lines, then keep your eye on the NHR website and link in with your local services, and we would be very keen to have discussions about that. I think it would be a pity for many, a lot of things that people have raised here, about the rollback families, for example. What have we done? There's opportunities to do more. Yeah, there's limits, of course, of how much research you can bother people with, but in principle, those are really interesting ideas that we could look at.
Okay, one final question from the chap at the back there.
Hi, Steve. Oh, sorry. Just a quick question around specificity. It's actually a question that came up for me this morning. How much standard evidence-based care is part of an open dialogue approach, i.e. how much of this is a framework, a value-based approach for teams approaching service users in crisis, and how much of it, when done well and early enough, actually replaces current structured evidence-based treatments? So how much overlap will there be between your randomized clusters? Linked to that, the other elements seem to have been the luxury of time and intensity. So we heard about 2-hour sessions a couple of times a week over times in crisis, something that a lot of standard care struggles to deliver, even if they wished and desired to do so. So how much do you control for intensity, and how do you control for structured evidence-based treatments within both your clusters?
I think there's a limit in relation to your first question. I think there's a limit for what you can for that which you can control in the way you describe. I mean, it's clearly seen as, if you like, an augmentation of aspects of traditional care, if you want to call it that. And indeed, I think part of the argument that Russell and colleagues might make is that actually open dialogue will facilitate better engagement with those other activities. So whether it's psychological or pharmacological treatments, open dialogue, as far as I see it, is not an alternative to them, but it might be something that ensures they're better delivered. So we will make efforts to prevent, contamination, people starting to do one thing where they shouldn't, and we'll do that. But I think the best thing we can do in relation to your first question is accurately describe what people get. And my favourite anecdote at this point is the case of assertive community treatment, where the initial meta-analyses looked that it was an absolute winner. We then did a trial actually on this patch with Helen Gillespie, and we found no benefits of assertive community treatment over standard care in the UK. The answer to that essentially is standard care in the United States is terrible, and it's not difficult to be better than it. We may moan about the quality of care provided by our CMHTs, but actually it's a damn sight better than standard care in the US. And that's a challenge for open dialogue. Just to come back to it in this trial, we're setting a pretty high bar. The second question about the intensity of treatment, I think that is, for me, is partly a cost-effectiveness question. You are putting more time in at the front end. Is that greater time that you put in the front end associated with better long-term outcomes? And are those better long-term outcomes associated with value for money? So I think we try and deal with that perfectly reasonable point you've just raised there by looking at it somewhat empirically.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve.
Thanks very much.
Okay, then it's me. I would like to introduce myself. I am Mark Hopfenbeck. I have the joy of working with Russell and Val on organizing the training, and I will present the theoretical perspective on the training. If you want to learn what it's really like, you have to ask the students. So could I get all present and past students to stand up, just so everybody knows who you are? Students? So if you want to know what it's really like to be a pod student, you can ask one of these persons. Thank you guys for making it all possible. So I guess there's different ways of thinking about the training. I think there's different ways of thinking about what peer-supported open dialogue really is. For me, it's essentially a humanizing of mental health care. It's not a skill, it's not a technique, it's not a method, it's not a model. It is a paradigm shift. For some people, that change is very small because they're already there. For the system as a whole, I think it's huge. And I think it is very simple, as Heather talked about. But my experience is it's not very easy. Because it's not about them, it's about us. It's not about doing something to, it's about being with. With everything that you have, with everything that you bring. It's not about being a therapist. It's about being Mark or Jill or Anne, who has a mother and a father and a sister and children, and who has lived and who has experienced pain and has experienced shame. And if you're not willing to go there, if you're not willing to share that, then maybe you're not ready. Because I think if we are going to help people, it's not a psychologist or psychiatrist or a nurse. It's Bill or Bob or Jane. It's a fellow human being who is going to be able to be with that person on that journey as they heal themselves. And if you accept that, then what does the training look like? Well, I've been trying to figure that out for about the past 15 years. I was working in Norway. I'm an American, have been living 30 years in Norway, moved to Oxford about 3 years ago, serendipity, and that way I got involved in this. But 15 years ago, I was approached by a group of people, clinicians, service users, carers, who were working in a very rural mountainous region of Valdres in Norway. And they said that we want to change the way we work. And our motto is, it's only natural. And at the time, I was teaching social network theory and social network therapy and health and social policy and cultural perspectives on mental health care. And it all of a sudden just made sense. It's only natural. I was speaking earlier today with our guest from Scotland about how open dialogue resembles Maori cultures of mental health care. One of the persons that inspired the Valdres group was Carolyn Atneve. She was a Native American Indian, a Delaware Indian, who was working during the 1960s on reservations. And it didn't work. She says, you know what? We've been doing this for 10,000 years. What we need is a re-tribalization. We need to get back to our community. We need to use our indigenous resources, our indigenous ways of being, our traditional ways of spiritual growth to solve these problems. And I think if we do look at indigenous systems of care, open dialogue is much similar to that. It's simply human, and that's why it's sustainable. And that's why some people don't like it. It's basically using the natural resources within a social network to help a person in crisis. Simple but not easy. We worked on it for a while, we're still working on it, and what we came up with is a kind of a combination of things which in themselves are fairly basic, but when we combine them, become very strong. So we thought, peer-supported open dialogue is value-based practice, mindfulness and self-work, social-political approach to recovery, relational skills, trauma-informed care, and peer support. If you combine those things at the same place, at the same time, it'll work magic. The challenge is getting there. So value-based practice. I believe that no matter what method you learn, what skills you have, what will determine how you react, how you respond in a given situation, will be based on your values. What values steer your behavior in your everyday life? What values dominate the services you work in? Do you know? Does everyone have the same values? In Valders, anyway, we had a need to kind of make explicit what values were going to steer the way our services were developed. And we came up with, based on a Delphi study, focus group interviews, openness, authenticity, and unconditional warmth. Open dialogue, openness. The thing that hurts us in our daily interaction with our fellow men is a lack of love and absence of direct, honest relationships. What would it be like if all our relationships were direct and honest? Anybody there yet? No? Got some work to do there, I guess. Isn't that a realization? How much can we think about that? How indirect, how dishonest are our relationships? How more honest could they be? And how could we get there? That's what we work on. Another thing is transparency. When Jaakko Saikkula and his team in Western Lapland developed open dialogue, one of the two primary principles was nothing about them without them. Never talk about a patient, a client, without them being in the room. If you can do that and nothing else, it will radically change the way you organize your services. It will radically change the way you talk with people instead of about people. We tried to implement this, unfortunately, in Norway, and the psychiatrist kind of looked at me and she said, quote, "You can't really mean that." End of that project. It is difficult to implement. We've been trying for 15 years in Norway. Jaakko's been trying for 30 years in Finland, and it's still patchwork. The other thing is disclosure and self-disclosure. Just simply being there, being willing to share your own journey in situations where that seems right. And I wish we had an answer at how to know when it seems right. But that's what the training is all about. Learning the skill of disclosing artfully, compassionately, correctly, and being able to do that. And that has to do with authenticity. And again, most of us have heard about Carl Rogers, nothing new. And yet, how much training do we have in being authentic? I teach nurses, they go through 3 years of education. I don't think authenticity is named once. That's our healthcare education, at least in Norway. And again, it's simply a matter primarily of being a fellow human being. Before you're a psychologist or a nurse or psychiatrist, a fellow human being. Being vulnerable. Being willing to risk at an intimate human level. By doing so, you allow the others to do the same. And unconditional warmth, also that four-letter L word, known as love, and which some people like and for some strange reason some people hate, to bring love into mental health care. Jaakko and David Trimble have written a wonderful, wonderful article about dialogue as the embodiment of love. And I think we can also talk about unconditional acceptance. There is this idea of our own humanity, and you don't get there, I think, without having reflected upon your own humanity, without having dealt with your own challenges, your own personal traumas, which we all have. And to get there, we think that mindfulness may help. Russell has been teaching mindfulness retreats for years. I've been teaching a postgraduate program in mindfulness in Norway for the past 5 years. And we think that mindfulness training helps people to be present in their own lives, in their own bodies, and together with other people. How many of you meditate or have some mindfulness experience? Wonderful. It's growing. And some people it works, some people it doesn't. Some people will prefer prayer or some other form of meditative, contemplative practice. But there is this idea that self-work is essential. That not only do we work outward in the way we practice our profession, but we work inward regarding who we are as people. And Val may talk about it, but we do a lot of self-work on genograms, your own family history. One of the first things our students do is write their own autobiography to reflect upon their own lives and how they can use their own lives therapeutically. And then there's politics of recovery, of co-opting recovery. Is recovery forcing people back to work? We live in a society, I am a sociologist. I know that the powers that be will continually colonize and co-opt anything that works that seems to kind of answer their questions. So yes, we have to be concerned that recovery doesn't get co-opted. We have to be concerned that open dialogue doesn't get co-opted. That open dialogue is not simply a method, but it is a political statement about people living in social contexts, in austerity, in poverty, in inequality, in social injustice. And unless we're also willing to be activists, I don't think things will change. In Norway, there's a consensus that interpersonal skills are core competencies in mental health care. And yet, how often do you practice your interpersonal skills? Every day? Again, my nursing students do it very little. But you have to invest time. Open dialogue training does not occur during a weekend. Jaakko wanted us to do a 3-year training program. That was very intensive. Some people are doing it together with Nick, we'll talk later. We think we've got it down to a year, which is a start, which starts a process. What are these skills? It's easy. The only thing you have to do is be flexible, honest, respectful, trustworthy, confident, warm, interested, open, explorative, reflective, etc. And that's it. You've got the recipe. I've told my students to print this out and hang it on their bathroom door so that they're continually reminded of what they're actually supposed to be learning. But we know this works. And our training is essentially to work on this. When people talk about open dialogue, what do they very often talk about? Meeting Jasmine was fundamentally different. Meeting Russell was fundamentally different. Because of what? Because they embodied these things. Because they were able to do this. And by doing this, things escalated and changed within the social network. That's the way it works. And yet our mental health care systems today is not based on this. I think all of us were moved this morning by the stories, by Joanne, by Suzanne, talking about their life histories, having spent 30 years in the system, never being able to talk about their traumas, their life histories. This is what it's all about living, about pain, about being able to talk about that without self-stigma, without shame, being able to be proud that one is a survivor and not one of the 5,000 people that take their lives every year. If you're alive today, you've got a lot to be proud of, if you're a trauma orphan. So that's the way we should see it. We know that a lot of people within mental health care have experienced trauma. Accepting that, respecting that, creating contexts that are safe, based on trust and transparency, peer support. SAMHSA in the United States develops trauma-informed care, and it coincides exactly with open dialogue. Because that's the way it is my perception. And then peer support, peer support, peer support, peer support. Giving and receiving based on mutually shared experiences. And peer support means a lot of things, but mostly it means as many and as diverse and as often as possible, bringing more and more peers into our services, and having peers help us develop our services and deliver our services. I think we have a huge, long way to go until we're there, when there is also as many peers involved in our services as there are professionals. And we know also that there's mechanisms involved. It's not just something that's good to do politically correct. We know that peers represent something else than significant others. They represent a different resource, a different dynamic. They give us something more. And without them, we can't get these things. So peers are absolutely necessary. So the training is at the Friars in Kent. Beautiful place. Well, again, ask the students. We do have fun, but it is intense. We work hard. We live together. We cry together. We laugh together. Some of us drink together. It is a wonderfully intensive experience being together. We're now working with London South Bank University to make it the first English language postgraduate program in the world. And we hope to start on 23rd of January. It only requests 4 5-day residential modules. You will do some assignments, you will do some mindfulness work, clinical coursework, reading. Val and Russell and I organize it. We start the days with a little mindful movement, also known as yoga, for those who like to start the day like that. Russell runs an hour-long mindfulness session with us, and then we bring in the experts. I think today we made the final agreement with Anna. Thank you so much for being part of this. And it's a growing, dynamic kind of training that seems to change almost daily and weekly on how we will organize this. It's a wonderful, wonderful process. We have some of the best people in the world. Jaakko Saikala and Mary Olsen have just spent the last week with us at the Friars. It was wonderful. And you start to use it. From day one, preferably. Clinical work, supervision, meeting families, using the fidelity criteria that Steve mentioned. And I believe in writing. So you write a lot, you reflect together, sharing your experiences, being human together, and supporting each other, responding to each other. So if you want to create change, we will be soon recruiting, and it is not... I think everybody's got a brochure. That is Nick's training, which is a wonderful training program that he'll talk more about later on today. But pod training is a different training, and we will be recruiting soon. So if you're interested, if you want to create change, if you want to change as a person, if you want to change as a professional, if you want to change your services, if you want to change the world, this is a good place to start. I hope to see you in January. Thank you very much. So I'd like to present our friendly force of nature, Val Jackson. I guess I should thank Val for being here at all. She's the one who gave Russell my name. We met each other at an international psychosis conference in Tromsø, north of the Arctic Circle in Norway, 3 years ago, I suppose. Val has been an open dialogue activist for 15 years. She instigated an open dialogue trial in the EIP team in Leeds in 2014. She knows everybody that is anybody, more or less. Isn't that what we've concluded with? Yeah, so we just ask Val if we need to contact someone. Family therapist and a wonderful partner in crime, trying to change the world. Val?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Well, my first job was delivering newspapers. Oh, better stay here, hadn't I? But my sort of second job was as an occupational therapist. And I loved working in mental health services. It allowed me to see people as individuals with their own skills and interests, whereas in general hospital settings, patients were described as a stroke or a fractured femur. But even so, my mental health patients were seen as having an illness. They needed help and my support to discover or develop their skills to find a more productive life. I remember the group sessions, it kind of makes me cringe now. Social skills training. You all remember those? Assertiveness training, confidence building. You know, and I couldn't work out why some people never seem to move on with their lives. And it was a long time before I stopped using those dreaded words such as lack of insight. Not ready for change. And then I saw the light, and I realized that I and the service were missing something very important. So I retrained as a family therapist, and it opened my eyes to a whole new understanding, new to me. But as Mark has said, it's an ancient tradition, and I'm borrowing this phrase from Africa, Ubuntu. How many have heard of the word? Yeah. It's humanity. And it first appeared in written texts in the 19th century. And basically, I am who I am because of who we all are. So who are we? We are relational beings from our very first breath. We live in, are defined by, and develop in relationships. We, you and me, we're in relation at this very moment. You're all sitting there with your lovely faces and your bright eyes, each one of you with your own story. This space between us, your presence, your attentiveness, you know, that's all that's needed. It's an amazing world, with ever-changing interactions, ever-changing meanings that never stand still. But it took the rest of the so-called Western world, so-called civilized world, over 120 years or more, and 2 major world wars, before we began to embrace the idea that we called social constructionism. The idea that what happens here, the space between us, creates our sense of who we are. And dialogical practices are based on this philosophy. And family therapists who've trained in the last 15, 20 years are very familiar with these ideas. But many family therapists say to us, but open dialogue is what we do already. Well, in my experience, family therapy is an add-on. It's a service when others have failed. It's an intervention. We are intervening, a therapy. Families come because they see themselves as having failed. They see themselves as dysfunctional. I was there to listen, but there were expectations of change on both sides. I didn't have to say a lot, but I believed I was there to orchestrate the dialogue, aware of a responsibility and an intent. I wanted the families I worked with to have a glimmer of hope when they left the room, a sense that there was change taking place. And this intent was compounded by the very infrequent appointments. And I only worked for 2 days a week in early intervention services. And for many years, I was the only family therapist in Leeds, a population of over 700,000. This has changed very little in adult services in the UK. So I really don't think the NHS are going to fund all of us to go on a 3-year training course anytime soon. And I would see families many months or even a year or more after the client entered the service. But I want to tell you about someone who's very dear to me, a young man called Rick. He's generously agreed I can tell you this story. He came to meet with me a few times with his mum, his friends, his mum's friends, his ex-partner, and even his baby daughter. And he never felt comfortable in these meetings. The early intervention service took a very strong psychological view, in particular one of CBT with its formulations and hypotheses. And Rick's psychotic experiences were thought to be linked to his difficulties in being a new father, without ever having a father in his own life. And this hypothesis was so compelling. Both myself and his mum were guided by an idea that talking about this would help replace his experiences with words that would help him articulate his distress. Well, we looked through this gaze for at least 3 years. But Rick was steadfast in his refusal to join the dialogue. And, you know, we really tried to convince him that he really should talk. We tried all sorts of ways. Even the psychologist sort of going snowboarding with him. But then he moved on, and he went to live in a Soteria house in Bradford with a group of people. You know, they saw him as a friend, a companion, and they shared stories about life and the universe. And it was only after this experience, he started to meet willingly with me, his mum, and the rest of his network. And as long as we stuck to everyday, real-life events of living, of being in the moment, he started to talk about things that made him anxious or worried. I'd never mentioned my hypothesis to him, but I realized I was looking through a really powerful lens, and I learned a harsh lesson, and I apologized to the family for this. But family therapy has been through huge changes since its beginnings in the 50s, moving from a knowing position with the therapist as the expert to a not knowing position with the family as the experts in their own lives, from doing to being with, from seeing the problem as located in the family system to seeing the problem located in the relational space between us. So what's different about open dialogue? It's really not easy to explain until you take the journey. But the fundamental organizational differences significantly change the dialogue, particularly in the first meetings, with a family being seen at the very beginning, not because they're seeking therapy, because something very distressing has come into their lives and they want rid of it as quickly as possible. The team is there not to intervene, not to change, but to listen and acknowledge everyone's voice, and creating space for the members of the network to access their own resources. There to help the family and the network find their own path through the maze of mental health services. We're there as humans, capable of pain, joy, laughter and love. And we may share these with our families and their networks as fellow human beings. And our training and our roles, although they really are important, they take a back seat. As Russell would say, we keep them in our back pocket. So this is why our pod teams are composed of people with lived experiences, support workers, psychiatrists, family therapists, nurses and so on, connecting others with our shared language and experiences. It really helps to have family therapists in the service. They're like the glue that help maintain the focus on the network, the context around us, and the relational nature of our being. But I have seen our trainees, after a very short period, embrace the being with rather than the doing to, not needing to provide solutions, working alongside people from a wide range of backgrounds, people who become akin to my extended family, creates a remarkable sense of safety that helps us all tolerate uncertainty. And this is so important in the first few meetings, in the crisis, in the first few days, when everybody's struggling to find words. The open dialogue team is not there to orchestrate, but to listen, acknowledge, and create space for reflection. Tolerate uncertainty, pain, and silence. Not necessarily knowing, not having answers. Neither practitioner nor family member. The guiding principle is give all a voice, even the psychotic experiences. In the process, the family discover their own words, their own strengths, their own pain, and most importantly, their own agency. And the meeting may end without hope, and the only decision might be, let's meet again tomorrow. Before I finish, I want to read this poem written by Fari Razek, a member of the audience at a recent presentation that Russell and I gave in Eastbourne. Open dialogue is freedom to be human being and not human doing. Freedom to be uncertain and not be certain. Freedom to be in the unknown and not having to know. Freedom to be truthful, even if truth is bizarre. Freedom to be real in myself and not ashamed of being real. Freedom to be human with faults and not perfect. Freedom to be, and be. And Barack Obama, I knew you'd get a word in somehow, when he arrived in Britain last week, he said, "It's a complicated, connected world." How right you are, Barack. And what I want to say, isn't it time we went back to our ancient roots, to Ubuntu? And what I want you to do now, if you can, I'd like you to stand. I want everybody to stand. You can shake around a bit if you want. All those with arthritic hips. If it feels comfortable, I'd like you to hold hands with the persons on either side of you. This isn't meant to be fun, sorry. And I want you to repeat after me. Actually, I want you all to sit down and take your shoes off. I am who I am. Oh, this is really emotional. Because of who we all are. Just turn again to the people on either side of you and just repeat that. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few minutes of question and answers for Mark and Val before we break. So, I don't know if these speakers are. Okay, so if you've got people with a couple of mics to go around, just about 5 minutes. So we only have time for about kind of 3 questions maybe. So, anybody put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question to Mark or Val.
Hi, I'm Tom. I work in a outreach team here in Camden. I've got a question for Mark. One of the 7 principles of open dialogue teaches dialogism and polyphony. And a couple of places I've read is that open dialogue is rooted in philosophy. I was just wondering, for the diploma, the ELF diploma, is there a particular thinker of dialogism that you draw on, and what particular themes inform the practice? I'm thinking like Voloshinov, Bakhtin, or Buber.
I think Buber is an excellent place to start. The I-thou relationship. Jaakko Saikula has based a lot of his writings on Bakhtin, and the quote that goes again is, "There is nothing worse than a lack of response." So when we express who we are as people and our vulnerability, our pain, our anguish, our anxiety, there is a moral obligation to respond to that. And basically what we're doing in the training is simply learning to respond. I think Jaakko would say something like that. Thank you. That's a good question.
Hello, I wanted to ask this earlier actually about the research that hopefully will be done. But how does the use of antipsychotic drugs fit into this? Considering their rebound effects when people stop taking them, because it's like to do with the work that Robert Whittaker has done. So it's a whole aspect of it, in that people can be seen to be relapsing when actually they're suffering from the effects of the drugs that have distorted their brain. So I just wondered how, I mean, it's not a very pleasant aspect, but it is a real aspect if you've been in the system for 30 years on antipsychotic drugs. So.
Sure, and there are a number of people who have been in the system for many years who we're starting this work with. As you'll have heard this morning, we've had a number of families who we've been working with. And when it comes to medication issues, then we try to follow the philosophy in terms of the service user and their network taking charge of the situation. So, with a couple of people, they've wanted to start to reduce their medication. And actually, more often than not, they've had a very sensible plan to do that themselves in terms of doing it gradually. So we give people the option. Other people would rather not. They feel that it's supporting them and keeping them on a level, so they're maintained on it. So we leave the person to make the decision and the family, but we work with them, and if they are looking to reduce and they've been doing well and they've been gaining benefit from the meetings, then they can take charge of that process and start to do it incrementally, and they may ask questions about what's a good reduction regime kind of thing. So we work more collaboratively to let them take charge of the medication regime.
Hi, Angela from Together for Mental Wellbeing. One of the things I guess I want to say first of all is that the conference has been really, really enjoyable. I think probably the best conference I've been to in a long time. It's been really interesting. I'm really interested in kind of open dialogue and how you're sharing the information around it. One of the things that I've become a little bit more confused about, though, I have to say, is the peer support element of it. And for me, there's some questions around when you're talking about peer-supported open dialogue. Are you referring to I guess, anybody and everybody, those natural human conditions of being able to have the conversations around it, or within the context of mental health services within this country at the moment, are you talking very specifically about peer support and people who use mental health services and experience distress being the peer supporters within it? And some of the conversations, I thought I was quite clear around it, and as we've gone on, I'm becoming less clear around it, and I don't know if that's something that you've come across previously. You're talking around about the role of peer workers in particular, not being early days, but it's peer-supported open dialogue, which I think is maybe why I've got a little bit confused along the way with it. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, so we, yeah, it is, as we said, it's a work in progress. There's several different strands of it. So the first one is to try and make sure we have peer workers in every team, so we make that part of the culture. So we say that we try and assist every team doing this as a peer worker. The second is the broader definition of peer, if you like, where we all can see each other as peers. We all have our own form of lived experience and having that philosophy through it. And then also helping to create local communities of peers, and that's just beginning really. So Bradford Satiri, for example, have a very good way of trying to extend, bring volunteers through the local community to sit with people in distress. And we're beginning to think and talk with them about how to bring that aspect into it. And we're hoping that our local peers and our peer workers on the ground will begin to sort of develop that organically. So we're at early stages. A number of the trusts who we started working with didn't have any peers, so the peer workers in the teams are the first ones. So we're at early stages of trying to organically develop all these different strands of the peer support element. I don't know if you want to say anything more.
Did that answer your question?
I think so. I think so, sorry. I think it also, I guess, fits into, and I have lots of conversations with lots of people about peer support, and together we've developed kind of a peer model over about 5 years or so. And I think one of the concerns from my point of view, but I mean, I absolutely love the idea of open dialogue, and it's, you know, a big fan of it, but it's that thing around quite often within the service user movement, things that are created and led by people who are using services then can end up being something different when it's taken on a larger scale. And it feels as though there's something around, you know, and I absolutely appreciate it's a newer strand of work and peer being a peer in lots of different settings, but that could be quite confusing for lots of people and goes against maybe the grain that within the service user movement about the origins of peer support in this country.
Hi,
thanks.
This might sound a bit idealistic. It's going back to the research, so it's mainly for Steve. I work for NELFT, and our top value, if you like, is for the patient to be the centre of everything that we do. And I'm just thinking about how that can be part of the evaluation and the research, because, for example, someone this morning, one of the very powerful stories was a woman describing her breakdown as a brilliant breakdown that she was glad had happened. So it seems to me using relapse as the only measure, as far as I can understand what you're saying, as the measure of success. You know, some people, I would prefer to call them lapses than relapse anyway. You can't ever go backwards, you're only ever going forwards. But to use something which is so-called relapse and nothing else to do with what the service user sees as their own recovery, it seems to me if the research isn't patient-centred, then how can the treatment really be patient-centred?
Well, there's a very quick and simple answer to that is the requirements of a research program such as I set out means that you have to have what's in the jargon called a primary outcome around which you build things like the number of people you need in the trial. We have a number of secondary outcomes of which recovery is one measure. But just, so that's the explanation of why I emphasize recovery. To be honest with you, I actually think that broadly speaking, and it won't apply to everyone, repeated relapses or lapses are generally not associated with a good outcome and with good quality of life. So it absolutely will not capture everybody's experience, and maybe for the person you're referring to it wouldn't. But I think on average it does. And it gives us a measure which allows us to, I think, make a good argument for open dialogue's expansion within the English healthcare system. I think, frankly, if we didn't have a measure akin to that, we simply wouldn't get funded. So it's partly a function of the research, but there's a lot also of other work that we're doing, looking at, as I referred to, about people's experience, which will try to capture some of what you said. But, you know, there are compromises to be made with empirical research. This is just one of them.
So, also, I think it's difficult to kind of conceptualize it from the outside, but I mean, we have spent lots of time in researching outcome measures in a whole range of them, and there is a very long list of outcome measures in the end that we've decided to use. You have to put one at the top in order to do sort of calculations of numbers needed to treat and all these things, but there's a range of outcomes that are going to be measured from the study, which is why there'll be lots of papers that come from it. But also, there's also a very large strand, work stream 4, which is looking at qualitative experience. So there'll be lots of focus groups, there'll be lots of service user groups, and also peer groups that we'll be doing throughout the whole project in order to get those outcomes. So the £2.3 million is spent on lots and lots of evaluation. And although we have a headline, actually there's lots of stuff underneath that. And there are, as I say, there are so many scales that I haven't got around to reading them all myself, to be honest, because they're fairly exhaustive. But then there's the collaborative measures. And when we talked to Jaco, he also gave us some advice about collaborative measures we should use, and also focus grouping. So there's a whole panoply of things that are going to be used in the end. Okay, I think one more question.
Have you got time for one more?
One more, yes.
And we'll finish. And it's something that I find a little bit bizarre. It's the juxtapositioning of the word training, which to me is a controlled jump through hoops, tick box exercise, and God knows I have been the victim of trained professionals for the last 60 years as a service user, with something called open, which is open dialogue, which is something wonderful and free. And I think I've seen idiots sent for training and they come back as greater idiots. And I think words like education or learning or discovery, for God's sake, would be better than training. It's been used as a mantra here today. People keep saying training, 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 as if training is going to change everything. And it hasn't over the last 60 years. And I think we want to be careful with something as wonderful as open dialogue, that we don't attach it to the same old system.
Thank you. I think we're going to change it to peer-supported open dialogue, brilliant breakdowns for everybody. And we'll go from there. But thank you very much.
Okay, before we have a break, I've been asked if there are people from Scotland. You want to put your hands up? Oh, is there only one of you? Oh, here, okay. Been asked, could you actually meet in the foyer just out here? Because you want someone talking about collaboration.